For more than 7 decades, Dick Van Dyke has been America's smiling constant. The man who danced on rooftops, tripped over ottomans, and made laughter feel effortless. He was the face of joy in a black and white world, the voice of optimism during times of fear, and the performer who seemed almost untouched by darkness. But now, at 100 years old, with nothing left to prove and no image left to protect, Dick Van Dyke has finally admitted something that fans have quietly suspected for years. Behind the infectious grin, the iconic stumbles, and the timeless charm, there was a truth carefully hidden in plain sight. A truth about pain, fear, survival, and the heavy cost of being the happy one. This is not a scandal in the way Hollywood usually defines it. There are no shocking crimes or salacious headlines. Instead, what Dick Van Dyke finally admits is far more unsettling, and far more human. In this video, we'll uncover how one of the most joyful figures in entertainment history lived with shadows most people never imagined. And by the end, you may realize that the truth you always suspected was never about fame at all, it was about survival. Stay with us until the end, because what Dick Van Dyke reveals at 100 reframes his entire legacy, and may change the way you see happiness forever. Long before America ever questioned what lay beneath his smile, Dick Van Dyke became something far rarer than a movie star.
He became safe.
In living rooms across the country, families welcomed him the way they welcomed a favorite uncle or a trusted neighbor. He wasn't just funny, he was reassuring. At a time when the world felt unpredictable, he represented balance, kindness, and control. Nothing about him felt dangerous, controversial, or complicated. And that was exactly the point. Television in the 1950s and 1960s didn't just sell entertainment, it sold stability. Viewers wanted to believe that decency still existed, that laughter could be clean, and that goodness could win without shouting. Dick Van Dyke fit that need perfectly. He didn't rely on cruelty for humor or ego for charm. His comedy came from clumsiness, warmth, and an almost childlike humility. When he fell over furniture or danced with exaggerated grace, it wasn't mockery, it was humanity. Hollywood quickly realized what it had found. He wasn't merely an actor who could carry a show, he was an image audiences trusted without question. That trust followed him everywhere. Producers believed he wouldn't embarrass them. Parents believed he wouldn't corrupt their children. Networks believed he wouldn't challenge the system. And the public believed he would always be happy. But trust can be a cage disguised as love. Behind the scenes, that image became a responsibility heavier than any script. The moment he stepped into the role of America's happy man, there was no space left for complexity. There was no room for darkness, doubt, or exhaustion. He wasn't allowed to be tired of smiling, tired of performing, or tired of being strong. The world didn't ask how he was doing, it assumed the answer. And that assumption followed him for decades. Because when everyone believes you're okay, admitting that you're not feels like betrayal. Long before fame, before laughter, before applause, there was a quiet boy growing up in a world that didn't promise stability. Dick Van Dyke's childhood was shaped by uncertainty, economic struggle, and emotional restraint. He was raised during the Great Depression, a time when survival mattered more than self-expression. Feelings weren't discussed. Fear wasn't processed. You endured, you adapted, and you moved forward. His family did the best they could, but best still meant scarcity.
Money was tight.
Futures were unclear. And like many children of that era, he learned early that vulnerability wasn't useful. Strength meant silence. Humor became a tool, not just to entertain others, but to deflect attention away from personal pain. This was where the pattern began. As a child, he discovered something powerful. When he made people laugh, everything felt lighter.
Tension dissolved. Worry paused.
Laughter gave him control in a world where he otherwise had none. And more importantly, it earned approval.
People smiled. People relaxed. People liked him.
But approval, once tasted, can quietly become a requirement. Instead of learning how to express fear or sadness, he learned how to mask it. Instead of asking for help, he learned how to perform. These weren't conscious decisions, they were survival instincts. In a generation taught to endure rather than feel, he became exceptionally good at hiding discomfort behind charm. By the time he reached adulthood, the habit was ingrained. Humor wasn't just what he did, it was who he was. And when your identity is built around pleasing others, you risk losing track of yourself entirely. No one warned him that the very thing saving him as a child would one day trap him as an adult. When success finally arrived, it didn't creep in quietly, it exploded. Television made Dick Van Dyke a household name almost overnight. Audiences didn't just enjoy him, they depended on him. His presence meant comfort. His voice meant familiarity. His face meant everything would be okay by the end of the episode. But with success came expectation, and expectation came pressure. The industry didn't ask what else he wanted to explore. It told him what he already was.
Funny, cheerful, reliable, non-threatening.
There was little interest in seeing him angry, broken, or complex. Those traits didn't fit the brand. And the more beloved he became, the harder it was to step outside that frame. Privately, the weight grew heavier. Performing joy is far more exhausting than expressing sadness. It requires constant energy, constant awareness, and constant self-control. There were days when laughter felt forced, when the smile hurt to maintain, when the applause felt undeserved because it celebrated an image rather than a person.
Yet he kept going.
Because stopping would mean disappointing millions. And disappointment felt dangerous. This was the unspoken curse of his gift. The world applauded what he gave, not what he felt. And slowly, subtly, the distance between the two widened. The man on screen was confident, carefree, and complete. The man off screen was increasingly uncertain, questioning whether anyone truly knew him at all. By the time the suspicion began forming in the minds of viewers that something deeper lived behind that smile, Dick Van Dyke himself was already living with it. He just wasn't ready to say it out loud. By the time Dick Van Dyke reached the height of his success, the outside world saw only momentum. Hit shows, major films, constant praise, a career unfolding exactly as Hollywood promised it would. But internally, something very different was happening. Fame did not arrive as validation. It arrived as pressure. Every appearance came with expectation. Every performance carried the silent demand to be better than the last. Success stopped being a milestone and became a moving target. The applause grew louder, but so did the fear of losing it. In Hollywood, love is conditional, and Dick Van Dyke understood that instinctively. He knew the industry didn't reward honesty, it rewarded consistency. So he gave it what it wanted. He showed up smiling even when exhausted. He delivered laughter even when emotionally empty. And he learned how to compartmentalize pain so efficiently that even he struggled to recognize it. The schedule was relentless.
The stakes were high.
And the persona he had created, or perhaps had been given, allowed no cracks. What made it worse was how invisible the pressure was.
No one forced him to keep going.
No one threatened him outright. The pressure lived in expectations, contracts, reputations, and the quiet fear that if he ever slowed down, someone else would take his place. Fame had transformed from a dream into a responsibility he didn't know how to put down. The public saw a man thriving. The reality was a man holding himself together through discipline and denial. Pain doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides behind productivity, professionalism, and praise. Dick Van Dyke became a master at smiling through discomfort because admitting pain felt dangerous, not just to his career, but to his identity. The cheerful image didn't just belong to the audience, it followed him home. Friends expected him to be upbeat. Colleagues expected him to be easygoing. Even loved ones struggled to imagine him suffering, because suffering didn't align with who he was supposed to be. And when people don't believe your pain is real, you begin to doubt it yourself. This is how emotional isolation forms. Instead of asking for help, he minimized what he felt. Instead of addressing exhaustion, he pushed through it. He told himself that others had it worse, that success should cancel discomfort, that gratitude should override distress. These thoughts didn't heal him, they silenced him. Over time, the gap between appearance and reality widened. Laughter became performance rather than release. Applause became noise rather than reassurance. And silence became the only place where he could stop pretending, even if only briefly. But silence has a way of amplifying what you avoid. And eventually, what he avoided began demanding attention. For many years, alcohol quietly filled the spaces where rest and honesty should have been. It wasn't dramatic at first. It wasn't reckless or public.
It was functional.
It took the edge off anxiety. It softened the pressure. It made the smile easier to maintain. That's how it often begins. Alcohol didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like relief. A way to slow racing thoughts.
A way to sleep.
A way to cope without asking anyone else for help. In an industry that normalized excess and celebrated indulgence, no one questioned it, and that made it even more dangerous. Gradually, reliance turned into routine. Routine turned into necessity. And necessity began shaping decisions. Alcohol became a tool for survival, but it also became a wall, separating him further from confronting what he truly felt. The most painful part wasn't the drinking itself. It was the secrecy. The knowledge that the public image depended on control, while his private life felt increasingly fragile. The irony was brutal. The man known for clarity and joy was numbing himself to get through the day. Eventually, the cost became impossible to ignore.
Health began to suffer.
Emotional balance eroded. And the fear he had spent a lifetime avoiding, the fear of losing control, stood directly in front of him. This was no longer about image. It was about survival. There are moments in every life that divide time into before and after. For Dick Van Dyke, those moments didn't arrive with dramatic headlines or public confessions. They came quietly, unexpectedly, and often alone. Health scares, sudden collapses, and close calls forced him to confront a reality he had spent decades outrunning. The body keeps score, and it eventually demands honesty. Years of relentless work, emotional suppression, and alcohol use had consequences. Exhaustion was no longer something he could laugh off. His body began sending warnings he could no longer ignore. There were incidents where he came dangerously close to losing everything. His health, his independence, even his life. And yet, most people never knew how close it came. What made these moments terrifying wasn't just mortality, it was clarity. Near-death experiences strip away illusion. They leave no room for image, expectation, or reputation. In those moments, there was no audience to entertain, no smile to perform, no role to play. Just a man confronting the question he had avoided since childhood: who am I when I'm not making people happy? These moments forced a reckoning. The laughter that once felt like armor suddenly felt thin. The charm that once protected him offered no defense against physical fragility. For the first time, the truth became undeniable: joy alone could not sustain him. And survival would require more than endurance. Publicly, his relationships appeared stable, even idyllic. Privately, they carried the same imbalance that shaped much of his life. Love for him often meant responsibility, being supportive, being positive, being present in ways that never interfered with the image he maintained for the world. But relationships demand more than kindness. They demand vulnerability. And vulnerability had never been his strength. There were moments of deep connection, genuine affection, and shared history. But there were also silences, unspoken frustrations, emotional distance, and regrets that only became clear in hindsight. Being the happy one made it difficult to admit confusion, sadness, or dissatisfaction within a marriage. When problems arose, he often tried to smooth them over with humor rather than confront them with honesty. Over time, this created emotional gaps. Not from lack of love, but from lack of expression. Looking back, he would later acknowledge that he didn't always show up as fully as he could have, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to be open without feeling like he was failing someone. These realizations didn't come easily. They arrived with age, reflection, and the painful understanding that time doesn't grant do-overs. Love, when filtered through performance, loses something essential. And that realization stayed with him. Depression doesn't always look like sadness. Sometimes it looks like productivity. Sometimes it looks like charm. And sometimes, it looks like a man dancing across a screen while quietly struggling to get through the day. For years, Dick Van Dyke experienced periods of deep emotional heaviness he couldn't explain. He had success. He had admiration. He had opportunity. And yet, there were days when simply existing felt overwhelming. This contradiction confused him. How could someone so fortunate feel so lost?
So he didn't talk about it.
In a generation that rarely acknowledged mental health, depression was something to endure, not discuss. And as someone whose career depended on optimism, admitting depression felt especially forbidden. He worried it would disappoint people. He worried it would redefine him. Most of all, he worried it would confirm his greatest fear, that he wasn't truly the joyful man everyone believed him to be. But the truth was more complex.
He wasn't a fraud. He was human.
Over time, the weight of unspoken depression compounded everything else. The pressure, the alcohol, the isolation. The dance continued, but the joy behind it faded. What audiences saw as effortless grace required immense internal effort. And slowly, quietly, the suspicion many fans carried, that there was something deeper behind the smile, became reality. Because behind the dance was not darkness alone. It was a man learning, far too late, that happiness performed is not the same as happiness lived. Every performance has a limit. For Dick Van Dyke, the breaking point didn't arrive with a single catastrophic event, it arrived as accumulation. Years of pressure, unspoken depression, physical exhaustion, and quiet dependence on alcohol converged into a moment where continuing as he always had was no longer possible. The warning signs were everywhere. His body resisted the pace it once tolerated. His mind struggled to maintain the optimism expected of him. And the emotional disconnect he had lived with for so long became impossible to ignore. What once felt manageable now felt suffocating. The smile, once second nature, began to feel like a lie he could no longer sustain. This was the most dangerous phase, not because of scandal or collapse, but because of isolation. When you are admired by millions, it becomes harder to admit you're falling apart. There is shame in struggling when the world believes you have everything. That shame kept him silent longer than it should have. But denial has a shelf life. Eventually, the illusion cracked. He could feel it in his health, in his relationships, in the quiet moments when distraction failed. The realization was terrifying but necessary. If he didn't change, something would be lost forever.
Not his career, his life.
The breaking point wasn't loud.
It was honest.
The hardest confession was not public. It was private. Before Dick Van Dyke ever spoke openly about his struggles, he had to face them alone. He had to accept that strength didn't mean endurance at any cost. That happiness couldn't be manufactured indefinitely. That being loved for an image had prevented him from being understood as a person. Admitting the truth to himself required dismantling decades of conditioning. He had been rewarded his entire life for pushing through discomfort.
For not complaining.
For showing up cheerful no matter what. Letting go of that identity felt like stepping into uncertainty without armor. But honesty brought relief. For the first time, he allowed himself to name what he felt: depression, fear, exhaustion, regret. Naming them didn't make them disappear, but it made them manageable. It replaced shame with understanding. It turned survival into intention. This internal shift marked the beginning of real healing.
Not perfection. Not instant joy. But balance.
And for the first time in decades, he wasn't performing for anyone. Reinvention didn't come with fanfare. There was no announcement, no dramatic exit, no public declaration of change. It happened quietly, deliberately, and on his own terms. He began choosing peace over productivity, reflection over distraction, honesty over expectation. Stepping back didn't mean disappearing, it meant redefining what mattered. Success was no longer measured by applause or relevance, but by well-being and connection. Silence became restorative rather than threatening. Without the constant demand to entertain, he rediscovered parts of himself long buried under responsibility. Creativity returned without pressure. Joy resurfaced without obligation. Most importantly, he learned that slowing down wasn't failure. It was survival. This reinvention didn't erase the past, it contextualized it. The laughter, the success, the legacy all remained intact. But now, they belonged to a man who finally understood that his worth was never dependent on how much happiness he gave away. And with that understanding, the final chapters of his life began. Not as a performance, but as a truth. Aging is difficult for anyone. Aging while the world watches is something else entirely. As the years passed, Dick Van Dyke became more than a performer. He became a symbol of time itself. Each public appearance carried unspoken expectations. People didn't just want to see him, they wanted reassurance. Proof that joy could last. Proof that the past wasn't gone. But aging doesn't negotiate with nostalgia. Physically, the changes were unavoidable. Energy came and went. Recovery took longer. The body that once danced effortlessly now demanded care and patience. Emotionally, aging brought clarity, and with it reflection. Looking back across decades forced him to confront not only what he achieved, but what it cost. The public praised his vitality, often marveling at how young he seemed for his age. What they didn't see was the discipline behind that resilience, or the acceptance it required to let things go. Staying active wasn't about defying age, it was about respecting life. And respecting life meant acknowledging limits rather than pretending they didn't exist. For the first time, he allowed himself to age honestly. No longer chasing relevance. No longer proving anything. Just living. And that, in many ways, was the bravest role he had ever played. People often asked how he did it. How he stayed optimistic. How he survived losses, mistakes, and decades of pressure without becoming bitter. The assumption was that happiness came naturally to him. The truth was simpler and harder. He kept going because he learned how fragile life is. Near-death moments had stripped away illusion. Depression had humbled him. Recovery had taught him gratitude. Continuing wasn't about ambition anymore. It was about presence. Movement became medicine. Creativity became connection. Gratitude became discipline. He didn't deny pain. He acknowledged it and chose not to live inside it. That choice had to be made daily. He also kept going because he understood something most people learn too late. Joy doesn't arrive when everything is perfect. It arrives when you stop waiting for perfection. By letting go of expectations, his own and everyone else's, he found peace where applause could never reach.
This wasn't denial.
It was wisdom earned the hard way. At 100 years old, there was nothing left to protect.
No brand to defend.
No reputation to manage. No expectations to uphold. And in that freedom came honesty, not dramatic, not shocking, but quietly profound. The admission wasn't a confession of scandal. It was an acknowledgement of truth. That he hadn't always been happy. That laughter had sometimes been armor. That joy, for much of his life, was something he gave rather than something he felt. What he finally admitted was what many had long suspected: the man who made the world laugh spent years learning how to save himself. There was no bitterness in this admission. Only clarity. He didn't regret the joy he brought others. He simply wished he had learned sooner that caring for himself didn't diminish his gift, it strengthened it. At 100, he wasn't rewriting his legacy.
He was completing it.
For years, audiences sensed it without being able to name it. There was something deeper behind the smile, something more fragile beneath the effortless charm. It wasn't sadness exactly, it was restraint.
A carefulness.
A feeling that the joy being offered came at a personal cost. Viewers saw it in fleeting moments, a pause before laughter, a softness in the eyes, a vulnerability that slipped through despite decades of polish.
These weren't flaws.
They were signals. Signals that the happiness on screen was not the absence of pain, but the triumph over it. What people suspected wasn't that he was unhappy, it was that he was carrying something. That the laughter came from experience rather than innocence. That the joy was earned, not automatic. At 100, his admission didn't shock the public.
It validated them.
It confirmed that intuition is powerful. That audiences, even across generations, recognized authenticity even when it was partially hidden. The suspicion wasn't rooted in doubt, it was rooted in empathy. People sensed a fellow human being behind the icon. And when he finally acknowledged it, the response wasn't disappointment.
It was relief.
Being loved by millions sounds like the ultimate gift. And in many ways, it is. But mass affection comes with a price rarely discussed: the loss of privacy, the loss of imperfection, and the pressure to remain worthy of that love at all times. For decades, Dick Van Dyke carried that weight. He understood that people didn't just love his work, they loved what he represented.
Kindness, safety, optimism.
And once you become a symbol, stepping outside of it feels like letting people down. That responsibility shaped his choices. It influenced what he shared, what he hid, and how long he waited to speak honestly. Being beloved meant being careful. It meant prioritizing others' comfort over his own truth. Loneliness can exist even in constant admiration. Applause doesn't ask how you're doing. Praise doesn't sit with you in quiet moments. And fame doesn't automatically translate into understanding. The cost of being beloved was emotional restraint, the feeling that authenticity might fracture the very love he depended on. Only later did he realize that real connection doesn't come from perfection. It comes from honesty. 100 years offers perspective few ever gain. Looking back, the lessons were clear, not in theory, but in lived experience. Happiness is not a personality trait.
It is a practice.
Strength is not silence.
It is self-awareness.
And laughter, while powerful, is not a substitute for truth. Dick Van Dyke's life became a reminder that joy and struggle are not opposites, they coexist. That giving happiness to others does not excuse neglecting yourself. And that vulnerability, even late in life, is never wasted. The most important lesson wasn't about fame, longevity, or talent. It was about permission to be human, to change, to rest, and to speak honestly when the time finally comes. At 100, his story isn't one of illusion being shattered. It's one of truth being completed. Legacy is often measured in numbers: awards won, years worked, records broken. But as the end of the journey comes into view, those measurements begin to feel shallow. What remains is impact,
meaning, truth.
For most of his life, Dick Van Dyke believed his legacy would be laughter, and for generations it was. But as reflection deepened with age, another legacy quietly emerged. One built not on perfection, but on honesty. On the courage to admit that joy can coexist with pain. That strength can exist alongside struggle. That even the happiest faces carry unseen battles. By finally speaking openly, he redefined what it meant to be admired. He showed that longevity isn't about never falling apart, it's about learning how to rebuild. His story gave permission to millions to question their own masks, to reconsider what being okay really means, and to understand that vulnerability does not erase worth. The laughter will always remain. The dances, the smiles, the memories are permanent. But now, layered beneath them, is something deeper. A truth that makes the joy more meaningful, not less. This is how legacies evolve. Not by hiding the cracks, but by letting the light pass through them. The final smile is not a performance. It is quieter than applause, softer than laughter, and more powerful than any role ever played. It comes from acceptance of the past, the pain, the mistakes, and the moments of grace that carried him through a century of life. At 100, there is no rush.
No pressure.
No need to prove anything. Only reflection, gratitude,
And peace.
The man who spent decades making the world feel safe finally allowed himself the same kindness. He didn't erase his struggles.
He honored them.
And in doing so, he reminded us that a full life is not one without hardship. It is one lived honestly, even when honesty comes late.
The smile remains.
But now we understand it.
Not as a mask, but as a victory.
If this story moved you, if it made you see joy, fame, or even your own life a little differently, then don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We tell stories not just to remember celebrities, but to understand ourselves. And sometimes, the most powerful truths are revealed not in scandal, but in honesty. Thank you for watching until the end.